March 11th, 222 AD, a 14-year-old boy wearing silk robes, worth more than a legion's annual wages, stands in the Palatine Palace, his face painted with cosmetics imported from the East, his neck draped with twisted religious symbols that make the Praetorian guards shift uncomfortably. Behind him, servants carry blood-stained fabric and shattered jewelry, items that once belonged to people who believed their noble birth would protect them. This is Elagabalus, and in just 4 years, this child will commit acts of systematic cruelty that will make Roman senators weep in terror and reshape the empire's understanding of human depravity. But the horror of his reign begins long before Rome ever knew his name. His birth name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, born in 204 AD in Syria, a land that horrified traditional Romans with its ancient cults and practices that blurred the lines between worship and violation. From his earliest memories, the boy who would become Elagabalus learned that as a vessel of the divine, normal human rules simply did not apply to him. His mother, Julia Soemis, possessed unlimited ambition and saw her son not as a child to be raised but as a weapon to be sharpened. In the Syrian temples where young Varius served as priest to the sun god, he witnessed ceremonies that mixed religious devotion with acts that would have been criminal anywhere else in the empire. He learned that pleasure was divinely commanded, that pain inflicted on others was a form of worship, and most dangerously, he learned that tears and violence were equally effective tools for getting exactly what he wanted. What truly forged the monster was the complete absence of anyone willing to tell him no. Servants competed to fulfill his every whim before he could even voice them. Tutors praised cruel games as natural signs of leadership. Family members saw his intelligence and striking beauty not as gifts to be nurtured but as political assets to be exploited. By the age of 10, young Varius understood that tears could bring him anything he desired. By 12, he discovered that violence brought even faster results. And by 14, when the Roman throne fell vacant after Emperor Macrinus was assassinated in 217 AD, the boy had already mastered the art of using human beings as objects for his entertainment. The conspiracy that placed him on the throne reveals something truly chilling about the people who enabled his rise to absolute power. Julia Soemis spread a transparent lie throughout the Eastern legions, claiming her son was the illegitimate child of the murdered Emperor Caracalla, making him the rightful heir. The story was obviously false. The boy resembled no one from the imperial bloodline, and the timelines didn't remotely match. But soldiers frustrated with pay cuts under Macrinus chose belief over truth when Julia Soemis arrived with stolen temple gold, buying loyalty from key commanders with promises of plunder and elevated status. Here is what should freeze your blood. This wasn't just about placing a teenager on the throne. Julia Soemis had spent years observing her son's developing character, watching his casual cruelty evolve into something calculated and methodical. She knew exactly what kind of monster she was unleashing on Rome, and she did it anyway because she saw his depravity not as a problem to be managed but as a political asset to be weaponized. The Battle of Antioch in 218 AD was less a military confrontation than a political collapse orchestrated through bribery and promises that would never be kept. When Macrinus arrived with his loyal troops, he discovered that most of his eastern legions had already declared for the pretender. The emperor died fleeing toward Rome, and his severed head was sent as a trophy to the teenage boy who now claimed imperial power. Witnesses described how Elagabalus received the news while performing mourning rituals in his temple. The 14-year-old smiled when shown his predecessor's head, but it wasn't the triumphant expression of a victorious general. It was the pleased look of a child who had just received an especially entertaining new toy, and he immediately began planning what games he could play with the prisoners captured in the battle. His first acts as emperor established patterns that would define the nightmare to come. Captured officers were forced to participate in elaborate competitions where they could supposedly earn their freedom, but the rules kept changing in ways that had nothing to do with military tradition and everything to do with the boy emperor's growing fascination with human degradation. The races around the temple complex began innocently enough but quickly evolved to include obstacles that forced participants to crawl through filth, followed by requirements that losers submit to punishments that grew increasingly intimate and creative with each iteration. The Syrian priests encouraged these innovations as expressions of religious creativity, never recognizing or perhaps not caring that they were nurturing signs of developing sadism in a child who would soon have absolute power over millions. Those who resisted these new entertainments didn't face dramatic public executions. The march to Rome became a moving carnival of systematic degradation that shocked even hardened soldiers who had witnessed the worst of Roman military campaigns. Elagabalus traveled in an elaborate litter carried not by strong men but by slaves specifically chosen for their physical beauty. Having discovered early that surrounding himself with attractive people somehow increased his sense of divine perfection, he began treating human attractiveness as a resource to be collected and consumed. and each city along the route was required to provide tribute in the form of their most beautiful young citizens. These weren't hostages in any traditional military sense, and they certainly weren't volunteers. They were human ornaments for the emperor's traveling pleasure palace. Boys and girls barely adolescent, torn from their families to serve purposes that became clear only after it was far too late to escape. What happened during those travel nights was whispered about in desperate letters between governors who were trying to warn each other about what to expect when the imperial procession reached their territories. The emperor's tent was larger than most houses, divided into specialized chambers serving different purposes. Religious shrines where he performed Syrian rituals mixed with his own creative additions. Bedrooms where he entertained himself with the beautiful captives. But most disturbing were the chambers designated for what he called educational sessions. The 14-year-old would gather his tributes and deliver lectures about their new roles in divine service, providing comprehensive instruction in organized degradation that no child should have been capable of conceptualizing, let alone implementing with such systematic efficiency. Those who disappointed him or showed the slightest resistance didn't face punishment in any conventional sense. They were simply and quietly removed from the traveling court, and the servants learned very quickly that asking questions about empty tents or reduced numbers was itself a dangerous act that could lead to joining the disappeared. When Elagabalus finally arrived in Rome, the Palatine palace that had echoed with the footsteps of Augustus, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius for centuries became something unrecognizable within months. His first priority wasn't learning how to govern the empire, but redesigning his living spaces for what he called divine ceremonies. He demolished traditional Roman religious spaces that had inspired respect and reverence for generations, replacing them with chambers that mixed Syrian temple architecture with innovations that came entirely from his own imagination. These new spaces featured altars carved with explicit scenes, walls painted with imagery that made experienced soldiers physically ill, and specialized furniture whose purpose became horrifyingly clear during the private rituals that began occurring with increasing frequency. Palace staff were reorganized into new categories that had nothing to do with traditional Roman household duties. Some were selected purely for physical attractiveness and assigned to ceremonial service that grew more demanding and more intimate as the emperor's appetites escalated. Others were chosen specifically for their discretion, tasked with maintaining specialized equipment that kept arriving from Eastern craftsmen who had been given disturbing commissions. A third group existed solely to clean up after the emperor's entertainments, and dispose of evidence that might prove embarrassing if discovered by the wrong people. But most concerning were the servants who simply disappeared after receiving direct service assignments. There were no formal executions, no announced crimes or public trials. They were simply there one day and gone the next, their quarters immediately reassigned as if they had never existed at all. What made the palace truly horrifying wasn't just the private perversions, but how Elagabalus began incorporating his experiments into official state functions, forcing senators and foreign ambassadors to witness ceremonies that mixed governmental business with activities that had absolutely no precedent in Roman history. A typical audience with the emperor now included performances that made experienced politicians physically ill. Foreign diplomats arriving to negotiate trade agreements found themselves watching scenarios involving palace slaves that were too graphic to be recorded in official documents. Senators expecting traditional meetings about legislation were instead required to participate in religious ceremonies where they faced an impossible choice between compromising their own dignity or facing accusations of disrespecting the emperor, as divine authority, accusations that carried consequences everyone had learned not to question. But Elagabalus made a fatal error when he decided that palace slaves and courtiers no longer provided sufficient entertainment. His attention turned to Rome's most noble families and their children. Palace agents were dispatched throughout the city to create lists that read like catalogs of potential victims, complete with detailed physical descriptions and assessments of which families could be safely targeted. The first families to receive imperial invitations understood immediately that these were UNT requests but commands disguised as honors. Several senatorial families attempted to protect their children by sending them away from Rome or arranging hasty marriages. But the emperor declared that avoiding religious duty was itself a crime against the state, and sent imperial guards to bring back fleeing children and annul protective marriages by decree. The psychological pressure on Rome's elite became unbearable as they faced impossible choices between protecting their children and preserving their own lives. Some chose exile, abandoning everything rather than subjecting their sons and daughters to whatever the emperor had planned. But perhaps most tragic were the families who submitted, convincing themselves that cooperation would somehow protect them from worse fates. These parents delivered their own children to palace ceremonies, then lived with the knowledge of what they had enabled when traumatized sons and daughters returned home permanently changed. The end came on March 11, 222 AD, when Praetorian guards entered the palace during morning rituals and announced that Elagabalus was no longer emperor. The boy who had terrorized Rome for 4 years faced his final moments with the same petulant disbelief that had characterized his entire reign. Even facing death, he complained that his divine ceremonies were being interrupted, seemingly incapable of understanding that his victims had been human beings rather than objects for his entertainment. The guards killed him quickly, along with his mother, Julia Soaemias, then dragged their bodies through Rome's streets before throwing them into the Tiber River. But the story doesn't end with the emperor's death, because the legacy of his reign haunted Rome for generations. The systematic degradation he practiced created trauma that affected entire families and political networks. Children who survived his ceremonies grew into adults whose capacity for normal relationships had been permanently shattered. The new emperor spent years trying to erase evidence of his predecessor's reign, demolishing palace chambers and destroying records, but the trauma lingered in ways that shaped Roman culture for decades. Families became more protective, understanding that imperial favor could be far more dangerous than imperial displeasure. Most tragically, many of Elagabalus's victims never recovered, spending the rest of their lives seeking healing for trauma that had no precedent in human experience. The children who suffered in those palace ceremonies 2,000 years ago have long since turned to dust, but their suffering echoes through history as a reminder that some forms of evil are too destructive to be forgotten. We remember their pain not to sensationalize it, but to honor their humanity and ensure that the systems which enabled their victimization are recognized and resisted whenever they begin to emerge again. Because the capacity for such evil hasn't disappeared from human nature, it only waits in the shadows of every generation, looking for the perfect circumstances to awaken once more.